Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss escalation in Ukraine, Trump's cabinet picks, and the inter-left fight over Kamala Harris's loss. I'm joined by Geoff Shullenberger, Srapa Marizov, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Over the last several days, the Biden administration has made two significant escalatory moves in its support for Ukraine. One, authorizing the use of long-range missiles to strike targets in Russia. The other, authorization of use of anti-personnel mines to bolster Ukraine's defenses. This is notable because Biden is a lame duck president, and not only is he not running for re-election, not only is he not expected to serve another term, but neither is his successor. The White House is being handed to Donald Trump, along with control of the foreign policy apparatus. So there has been some speculation that these moves are intended to lock the Trump administration into a certain course in Ukraine. Geoff, how do you read these moves?
I find them quite disturbing, and I don't claim to know how to interpret them. My first extremely macabre response was to say, well, I guess they failed to keep Trump out by all the other means they attempted. So, perhaps they'd rather just kind of see the whole world go up in flames than see a second Trump inauguration, and have set out to make this happen in this kind of Dr. Strangelove way. But in all seriousness, yeah, it does seem that there's an expectation of a move towards a more conciliatory approach under the incoming administration. And so it seems plausible to me on one hand that that there's an attempt again to escalate matters so as to, in some sense, make that de-escalation more difficult. That there are several, more notches down it will have to be taken in order for that situation to be arrived at. And I suppose the other thing that might be going on is a kind of attempt to create problems within the incoming administration, which is going to have figures who have been more hawkish historically, including Secretary of State nominee Marco Rubio, who was largely a hawk on Ukraine for much of his career in the Senate, although by some accounts he's moderated recently. But in any case, you clearly have one contingent that is more hawkish, and then you have figures like Tulsi Gabbard who have been more conciliatory. And so this, potentially also sets up a kind of difficult internal conflict. By locking the U.S. into a course of action of supporting an escalation on the part of Ukraine, it perhaps heightens the tensions between the more hawkish and dovish camps within the incoming administration, which could delay a shift in course. I think the other question it raises is, clearly they're thinking about how Putin himself will respond to this. I suppose one strategic thing that has to be considered here is that they're assuming that they can get away with this kind of escalation, in part because Putin is assuming he will have a more conciliatory administration to work with in a few months, and therefore he won't, really ratchet things up to the sort of nuclear precipice, because he's assuming that things will get dialed back shortly. So, that there's kind of a weird logic here by which they're escalating, assuming that they can get away with it because Putin won't want to escalate further on his side, because the costs of doing so won't be justified, given that he can assume that the conditions will be better for him in a few months. So it's a very weird situation, and just quite disturbing, and I think does just kind of bring us back to this basic question of what is behind this administration's extreme commitment to uh, constant escalation within this conflict, and what exactly explains the incredible hostility to any more conciliatory approach. So I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but it certainly underlined the completely unwavering nature of this commitment, which has been, evident throughout this administration, and I think has been one of its greatest failure. I mean, I think overall foreign policy has been the greatest failure of this administration. There are many things that can be faulted with, but certainly in terms of how it's handled inflation, for example, which has been a problem across the developed world and indeed much of the world. It's the record is certainly better than in a number of other peer countries, but the foreign policy record, I think, is really a huge blemish on this administration, in a way that I would almost compare to the Lyndon Johnson administration, which, similarly to this one, had a sort of ambitious domestic agenda, wanted to build on and kind of return to the spirit of and build on the New Deal, the greatest era of democratic political achievement in U.S. history. And Biden sort of earned comparisons with FDR for the ambition of his domestic agenda. Yet, like LBJ, I think has had a truly disastrous foreign policy record on various fronts, and this latest series of actions just kind of puts an exclamation point on that aspect of this administration.
It's funny. One of the things that seems to be standing in the background here is the notion of Russia collusion. I do think there are very uh, clear kind of realpolitik reasons for why Biden would have done this. You mentioned one, Jeff. Maybe there is a genuine opening for a kind of costless escalation on the U.S. part, in theory, because Putin may be less prone to strike when he knows another leader is coming in. But the idea that Trump is somehow in league with Putin has been an organizing principle of the resistance to his political uh, ascent in America. And that not only activates the base, it seems to be believed at some level by a lot of Democratic Party elites. So I think one of the reasons this move must seem appealing to people within and around the Biden administration is that they are preventing Trump from uh, so easily coming to terms with a man he is assumed to have a not so secret sympathy with. Now, without relitigating every claim made on an MSNBC broadcast since 2015, I'd just like to cover a few points. One, Trump opposed the Nord Stream pipeline that brought gas from Russia to Germany. Uh, that's certainly not a Russia-friendly move. Uh, he also had, for years, urged Europeans generally and Germans specifically to spend more on defense, to build tanks, to hire soldiers. That likewise is not a Russia friendly move. And notwithstanding the kind of hopes or claims of some of the more dovish people around his administration, he generally had a pretty hawkish stance toward foreign adversaries. Now he also has prided himself on being a president of peace. In the 2024 campaign, he has promised to avoid World War III. But his basic attitude doesn't seem to be one of always advancing or accommodating Russian interests. He instead seems to be pretty keen to oppose them and to assert US interests, but in ways that avoid drawing us into bloody conflict. Now, is that maybe a very sunny view of what Trump's trying to do? Yeah, but that's how it seems to me. So, uh, yeah, maybe some of our contributors would have a different take on it, but I really think it's worth asking to what extent kind of unhinged idea of who Trump is and what he's been trying to do vis-a-vis Putin is influencing this decision. Meanwhile, at Mar-a-Lago, Trump is assembling his cabinet. We have a bunch of picks announced. Uh, why don't we just go through a few of these? One, Pete Hegseth, nominated for Secretary of Defense. Hegseth is a Princeton graduate. He was the publisher of the Princeton Tory, a magazine that I've read in my time. I met him through the magazine when I was an undergraduate. He had graduated several years before, and
Now
he
those tattoos are not they're not something you get as part of that position, right? They're not like there's not like a ritual where you get those tattoos
well,
when you run the Princeton Tory.
yeah, possibly if you're admitted to some of the higher orders of the Masonic rites or something. But I never could really hack it at that level. If so, they never introduced me to those mysteries. Um, he went on to be a kind of hawkish lobbyist, sort of support our troops guy, keep fighting the war against terror, keep supporting the war in Iraq, and ran for public office, became a Fox News personality where he's been quite successful, uh, on Fox and Friends, and now he's the nominee for Secretary of Defense. A couple of things, yes, you mentioned his tattoos, which have become quite controversial. One is a Jerusalem cross, you know a cross kind of showing a cross with four crosses surrounding it, a kind of map of the city of Jerusalem, a very a thing probably associated with both his trips to the Middle East and also with this real America FUCK yeah mentality that was very typical of the right in the early 2000s. As Toby Keith said, we're going to put a boot in your ASS like it's the 4th of July. And the kind of crass sort of quasi crusader aesthetics that sometimes accompanied that. That's how I read this cross, which has been seen as a far right symbol or a Nazi symbol. It's definitely not that. It's just uh, you know kind of it's a crime against taste. I'm not a big tattoo guy. Sorry, and it's cringy, but I think it's his way of just giving expression to that uh, Team America World Police ideology that you had in the early 2000s. Now, if you're a leftist critic of that, you can say, well, that's effectively fascist or that's effectively Nazi. But this, I mean, that's going to be a pretty wide condemnation of a lot of American politicians in both parties who supported that course of war and still in many ways seek its continuation. Uh, yeah, and then he had some other tattoo Deus Volt, a Crusader slogan. God wills it. Same thing. And broadly, Hegseth is an evangelical Protestant. I grew up as an evangelical Protestant, and I saw these insane threads saying, "Oh, these tattoos mean he wants to bring back medieval Christian civilization." Let me reassure you that evangelical Protestants who sing praise and worship songs are not trying to reconstruct medieval Christian civilization. Just really saw Hegseth as a somewhat exaggerated type of a somewhat exaggerated instance of a type that's very familiar to me, which is the kind of early 2000s guy who came of age in the early 2000s, probably listening to Creed and you know going too far with girls and then feeling very bad about it at youth group and thinking that America rules and terrorists drool, and that's Hex's formative ideology. So I think it's, certainly has its limits. Maybe seems a little meatheadish to some people if they would rather their Secretary of Defense be, consistently high-minded type. But yeah, the kind of presentation of him as some kind of extremist or white nationalist is just very, very unconvincing, and it's, I think, much more worth talking about, the legacy of the Iraq War, the War on Terror, uh, how the Trump administration has moved beyond that in certain ways, but maybe how it's still continuing some of its aspects and what we think of that. I think it would be much better to focus discussion on that than to engage in these sort of uh, media matters, kind of anti disinfo, sort of whatever, tracing the far right sort of speculations that people want to engage in. I mean, I saw one thread on Twitter denouncing Hegseth, and it was also talking about how he's the evangelical expression or Protestant expression of this far right movement that includes the radical traditionalist Catholic group Opus Dei. Opus Dei was a big topic during the Dan Brown years, but if you're a Catholic who kind of comes into contact with Opus Dei, as I have done for many years, you come to understand that they are the opposite of radical traditionalists. They're basically normie business guys who, they teach you to be dutiful to your wife and to show up to work on time. Or, it's so the people who are engaging in the speculation about Hegseth, it's just really crazy. One other thing I thought was quite interesting. Hegseth has been accused of sexual assault. That came out after he was announced as Trump's selection. It seems that the Trump campaign wasn't aware of it, but this grabbed my attention for one very simple reason: the timing. As the Washington Post reported, Pete Hegseth uh, is alleged to have assaulted a woman in a hotel room after he spoke at a Republican women's meeting in California uh, on October 7th, 2017. On October 12th, 2017, this woman reported the alleged sexual assault to police. On October 10th, 2017, Ronan Farrow published his blockbuster article in the New Yorker, uh, detailing alleged sexual assaults committed by Harvey Weinstein, a report that built on the work of reporters in the New York Times and really set off the Me Too movement. So I don't know if those two events interacted in any way, and if they did, it doesn't say anything about the uh, truth or falsity of the allegation, which I understand the woman chose not to press charges on, which again doesn't speak to its veracity. But the timing is very notable, and it's an interesting story in terms of the ongoing effects of Me Too.
Well, Matt Gaetz as well, it seems, is going to be, um, at the center of various allegations, which we don't need to get into specifically, but I'd point, I mean, people can read our piece by Dan McCarthy on the Gaetz nomination, which kind of discusses the
The
figure of the
case for
flawed
Matt
reformer.
Gates is the title. Case
Yes,
for Matt Gates, if you want to Google it.
and discusses the figure of the flawed reformer. The question of whether somebody who sets out to and promises to reform a corrupt system, should be a sort of squeaky clean, flawless person, or whether whether, as with Trump himself, voters are willing to overlook personal flaws. And it's worth also recommending a piece, not in our pages, but by our sometime contributor Zed Jelani, that goes back to the Clinton year, and discussing Gates and some of these other allegations goes back to the Clinton era. And, this is a familiar story to many of us, but, he goes back through the many feminists who robustly defended Clinton in the late 90s around all of these allegations. And, he simply makes the point that arguing that someone deserves support because of their political views and principles rather than and that personal failings and so on can be discounted or relegated to a sort of secondary concern is not an unfamiliar idea, and it's one that supporters of both parties have made over the years. So I recommend that piece by Jelani at his Substack, The American Saga.
In terms of McCarthy's article for us, the case for Matt Gaetz, that's, I think, a more counterintuitive headline than it usually is when you say the case for X nominee, because a lot has been written and said about the case against Matt Gaetz, right? Uh, so, you know, can you just tell me a bit about kind of what McCarthy sees as, uh, the virtues of a Gates nomination, and then maybe why some would think there are some real drawbacks to it?
Well, I think beyond his sort of, essentially kind of various allegations that have floated around him in terms of his, let's say, romantic slash sexual proclivities. I'd say the main objection that has been raised to him is that he will weaponize the Justice Department to go after, and that he will be in line with an intention by Trump to weaponize the Justice Department to go after political enemies. And so, I think what's kind of interesting here is that, of course, this has kind of already happened under the current administration. So, the question, in a sense, is whether there will be an attempt to kind of settle scores and enact some sort of retribution for the various kind of politically motivated investigations and prosecutions that have happened previously. So I think one of the main cases against him is that he's somebody who will will politicize the office of the Attorney General. And again, I think the best case against that is really that he's I mean, it's unclear what exactly he will do, but that what seems disingenuous from the people making that case is that they're denying that that is already what's been happening for some time. So,
Yeah. There's an irony here, right? I mean, I think one thing we've seen during the Trump years, kind of long Trump era, is that uh, it's often hard for kind of outsiderish or populist or somewhat rabble rousing movements to actually affect sweeping plans for change or social control or retribution, in part because there's this kind of autoimmune response on the part of the establishment or the system, which often just recoils from the this populist agenda or these populist personalities. Um, and sometimes, and as that autoimmune response is happening, that's when you see some of the very things that were initially feared, a kind of politicization of the system, or in a kind of uh, cabining of civil liberties, or seeming violation of neutral processes and norms. And this isn't, uh, I really think about any one political party. It's just a general fact, which is that threats to liberty and freedom are more likely to come from the political center, the political establishment, than from the fringe, just because that's where the power lies. Now, I'm not suggesting that Trump is powerless. He's been president. He's going to be president again, the once and future president. Uh, but his movement is a little more ramshackle than the Biden coalition, which is to a greater degree the party of government.
just returning briefly to the McCarthy piece, what he argues is that Gates is a reformer and specifically, and this I think is probably the thing that's most likely to challenge his confirmation in the Senate, which apparently Trump has privately said he, wasn't sure, but he wasn't sure whether he would be confirmed. Is that he's gone after and kind of cited the corruption of other members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and uh, as McCarthy points out, he's gone after members of his own party, which has not earned him um, accolades from the sort of Mitch McConnell establishment. So that's one thing, and then the other thing that's kind of notable and interesting about him is his antitrust stance, which Compact's contributor Matt Stoller has highlighted. That he is, even more so than incoming VP JD Vance has praised the antitrust efforts of figures in the Biden administration like Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor. And I think, for those of us who are sympathetic to the antitrust agenda, that's probably substantively the strongest case for him as a nominee, that he is somebody who's probably as Attorney General most likely to continue this aspect of the Biden
Yeah, and
administration's
I
efforts.
really had no notion that this was true of Gates. Sorry, it's really is my job to follow these things, but I basically just thought he was uh, MAGA ultra with uh, remarkable hairstyle and you know vague rumors of dissolution trailing him wherever he went. But yeah, he really does have some uh, views that distinguish him from the bulk of his party, as McCarthy laid out. Yeah, so why don't we go now, Jeff, to the that tension you alluded to earlier between the kind of two elements of the Trumpian economic program, right? It seems Trump was able to move relatively quickly through some things like defense, uh, Justice Department, some of these appointments. I think we have whatever the Bureau of Land Management guy, we have transportation. Uh, I don't know if we've got to head of NASA yet or whatever, or even or what's going on. Greenland Vizier, but getting the economic team in place is taking a little more time, and I that does reflect some conflicting concerns within the Trump camp. One way to put it would be the desire to see the stock market go up. That's a big imperative for Trump, and uh, then the other is to deliver on his trade agenda. He called himself the tariff man. He repeatedly said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, more so than love. Uh, kind of revision of St. Paul, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. For Trump, it's uh, love, hope, and tariff, and the greatest of these is tariff. So, how's Trump going to reconcile all this? Tall order, huh?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not as if these sorts of situations didn't play out in his previous administration. So it's not as unfamiliar as it might seem. But yeah, I think the question is, I think is also a kind of question of short term versus long term economic priorities, because and this has been something that hampered the Biden domestic economic agenda, in that it did kind of build on Trump's protectionist policies, expanded them, attempted to make good on his previous promise of kind of rebuilding manufacturing. And, quite a bit did come out of that, but it also is not something that's going to offer immediate benefits. It's going to take some time for these factories to be rebuilt and these industries to develop, and so that I think is part of the challenge, because I think what you've seen, you know, most clearly with and this kind of takes us into our final topic already, but this question of like, well, Biden did take on this kind of economic populist agenda, but he still lost. So is it worth even doing stuff like that? I think that is a question that hangs over this administration too, um, because some of the dividends of a more protectionist approach are going to take some time to pan out, and there's going to be negative effects on the stock market. Investors are going to be unhappy, and so I think there's a challenge of balancing long and short term thinking. Now, I mean, one other thing though I think is kind of interesting, which takes this kind of to the other extreme, is that you have figures including Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, there's kind of a bizarre episode before the election in which this online right figure named Fisher King, had some post where he was kind of fantasizing essentially about, a kind of brutal austere, if we get the sort of Musk Ramaswamy program of just, slashing 75% of the federal workforce or whatever, like, yeah, it's going to be brutal and the whole economy is going to crash and we'll have a few years of, a few very lean years. But, eventually things are going to blossom again and we'll be, America will finally be restored to its greatness. And the only reason this is important is because then Musk replied to this statement and sort of said, you know, yeah, exactly, or something like that. Um, so I guess like, there is kind of the other side of this, which is that you have people who appear to be kind of radical free marketeers and free traders, including, although I think Musk's own incentives are a bit mixed here because he does want to protect Tesla from competition from Chinese EVs, just as the rest of the auto industry does. But nonetheless, he's sort of praising Javier Milei, who's both slashing tariffs in Argentina and at the same time, enacting a kind of brutal austerity program of this sort. And Ramaswamy, his co-chair of this fake Department of Government Efficiency, sort of said, "Well, we need," I think yesterday or the day before, like, what we need
It's
is
real
is
and it's
Millet on
spectacular, okay?
steroids. What
It
we
is
need
not
is
fake.
like what Ramaswamy says is what we need is what Millet is doing on steroids or something like that. And so, that you have, basically two versions of a kind of anti-status quo approach. One of which would be the more protectionist and economic populist sort, right, which would focus on, again, these kind of priorities of rebuilding American industry, which are not going to kind of juice the stock market in the immediate term and have to be part of a longer term plan. Then you have the kind of middle of the road, um, approach. I would take it people like Lutnick would prefer, which is a more, or Scott Bessent, which is, just a more standard kind of GOP stay the course, but try to get your fiscal house in order kind of approach. And then you have the radical, um, the radical free market and free trade approach advocated by figures like Musk and Ramaswamy, which is essentially what happened, or essentially what we saw with Liz Truss, the short-lived British prime minister, who did, through proposing these kind of, a quite radical pro-market reform program, did sort of cause the investors to revolt and produce some short-term turmoil that sealed the end of her very short reign. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting. I think it's actually a sort of three. There are sort of three courses here, which are all in tension with each other.
Such a great description of some of the conflicting impulses, uh, going into all this. Sarab Amari, who is off doing better things today, wrote a great piece for Compact. Trump needs Robert Lighthizer at Treasury. And that was really an insistence that Trump focus on his trade promises and holding up Robert Lighthizer, the veteran trade negotiator who served in the first Trump administration as the man capable of doing that. I happen to agree with Sharab on this and uh, wrote another article praising Robert Lighthizer for the New York Times. He's a man who's admired by people who think it's imperative that Trump deliver on his promises to voters to move on these trade issues. Uh, One of the things that interests me about this is that the experts are so unanimous, really, in saying that these tariff measures aren't going to work. Now, there has been there's a variety of opinion, and some opinion has actually moved in a more pro tariff direction over time, especially in terms of countering a geopolitical threat. Uh, a figure like Angus Deaton, the distinguished author of with his wife in case on the deaths of despair. He has uh, moved and wrote an essay for the IMF earlier this year saying that he's no longer sure that free trade is always good or even that it has worked to reduce global poverty in the way that economists have generally thought uh, it does. But still, the economists are very much pro free trade and anti tariff, and Trump is defying them. Robert Lighthizer, working in Trump's first term, defied them. And at least on certain points where a man like Robert Lighthizer has broken from the economists, he seems to have enjoyed a certain degree of vindication. He opposed China's admission to the WTO, saying that it would ravage American manufacturing. And then we got that paper on the China shock talking about how nearly 1 million American jobs were probably lost as a result of that move. So there's an interesting element here uh, that kind of goes to basic political questions. Is it possible for the voters not just to elect a different candidate, but to choose a different economic course on trade matters? Or should it more properly be left to expert management? And there is an unspoken consensus between parties that whatever interests we represent or whoever we appeal to on the campaign trail, we should basically let certain guys who are very accomplished and have some degrees and have worked in these fields, should we just let them basically say what we should do? And obviously there's a very strong argument for that, but it's a more technocratic argument. It's not a democratic argument. And that's probably one of its weaknesses. Also, yeah, we may have mentioned this before, but on the last episode, we can move on from the cabinet. But I do think Elise Stefanik to the UN is a pretty brilliant pick because she'll just cause so much heartburn there. If you're not a big fan of the UN, she'll be perfect. She'll basically do the congressional Ivy League hearings just over and over for the UN. So if you don't like the institution, I thought it was just a masterstroke to send her there. Um, though it makes it harder for the GOP to hold the House, so that's a little downside. But yeah, let's move on. Enough of this cabinet stuff. Uh, let's move to something really interesting, which is intra-left debates, recriminations. A lot of people saying that Kamala lost because she went too far in indulging wacky left-wing ideas promoted by the NGO complex. That's totally true. It's totally true. You wrote a Substack about it, Jeff. If you're not getting the Compact Substack, you should subscribe. Jeff will be in your inbox every Friday. You have Sarab midweek every week, um, and we really shouldn't let the either the philanthropic industrial complex or left activist groups off the hook for the Dems' problems. Uh, we we should point out their role in all this. And I say that because I do want to broaden the indictment a little bit. So this is not about absolving anyone. It's instead about avoiding any unnecessary absolutions, because the center is responsible for this too. And one thing that has bothered me a little bit about the both writing about the Democrats' internal struggles before the election and then some of the autopsies afterward is the way in which the blame suddenly shifts entirely to the progressive left in a way that suggests that the Democratic center had no agency and was never an active participant in some of these disastrous ideas. Let's look at just the issue of immigration, right? Clearly, during the first Trump term, the Democrats committed to an insane suite of rhetorical proposals and policy proposals that have led them to disaster, including uh, the loss of the Rio Grande Valley, which was once a Democratic stronghold, uh, heavily Hispanic, and is now deep red Republican. Okay, so let's just look at immigration and how things went so wrong there. Now, was it just the case that these millennial squad socialists deluded our good, honest uh, liberals? No, no, it wasn't. In 2013, Hillary Clinton gave a speech to a Brazilian bank saying that her dream, and I'm going to quote Clinton here, her dream was a hemispheric common market with open trade and open borders. That's 2013. Meanwhile, in 2015, Bernie Sanders, the dangerous, radical, socialist, went on Ezra Klein's podcast and called open borders a Koch brothers proposal. Ezra Klein, the more sensible, centrist, technocratic Democrat, pushed Sanders on that hard uh, because Klein was an open borders guy in line with that Clinton ideology that she was expressing to the bankers. Now, the story here isn't that Sanders was right and nobly resisted the drift of the party. Not at all. He reversed himself and became more open borders than anyone practically. But the initial alignment wasn't, oh, you have this radical left pushing the center away from its sensible policies. No, there was an extremism of the center that was present, and it manifested itself through kind of inter-party dynamics. And when you had sort of progressive or radical people calling on the establishment to make these progressive moves, well, they were happy to do it because they were already there. They were already there, so they were happy to move. But it wasn't AOC elected in 2019 who turned the Democratic Party into an open borders party in rhetorical terms. It wasn't that one guy graduated from King's College in New York who promoted the "Abolish ICE" slogan. It wasn't him. I mean, Clinton was already saying open borders way back when, so it's really worth looking at that.
I was just going to
Yeah,
jump in and say one other thing, which is, I believe I'm looking for the citation, but all the way back in somewhere like the 80s, there was a I believe Wall Street Journal op-ed basically saying, right around the time of the end of the Soviet Union, the sort of end of history moment, there was a Wall Street Journal op-ed saying, what we need is open borders, essentially.
yeah. The Wall Street Journal. I think the formulation was something like this: we propose a five-word constitutional amendment. There shall be open
Yes,
borders,
right. Yeah, that is it. Yep.
and uh, and I think that's still the Wall Street Journal's official position. Interestingly, I think a lot of people don't understand this. The Wall Street Journal has official positions. One of them is that it's pro-choice officially, and that doesn't mean the actual staff there agrees with all its positions, but it has sort of a party line, and it's one of the things that makes the page, I think, valuable and interesting. Its op-ed page that it tries to uphold a certain line, and yeah, so certainly this was a bipartisan phenomenon. Clinton was not some kind of person who was really out of step with everyone else. I think she was giving uh, just voice to something that was widely shared across party lines. Let's look at trans issues too. Sarah McBride,
newly elected member of the U.S. House from the state of Delaware is a trans woman, biological male, and there was controversy over whether or not McBride would be permitted to use the bathrooms in the women's bathrooms in the U.S. Capitol. Now, McBride isn't a member of the squad, is not an acolyte of AOC or a follower of Bernie Sanders. Instead, McBride came into politics through involvement in Joe Biden's campaigns. McBride was a student government type at American University. Biden wrote a foreword to McBride's memoir. And McBride is really just a standard Democratic Party operative type. Uh, Biden has a long record of supporting transgender causes. Biden criticized Bernie Sanders in 2020 when Sanders was getting Joe Rogan's endorsement. And Biden in the White House has done everything he can to push forward transgender causes. So now, when you have all of these postmortems and people are saying, look, progressives pulled us too far in this direction, they brought in too much of this crazy trans stuff, and if only we had got rid of these crazy millennials and people had listened to us, good, solid Democratic Party operative types, none of this would have happened. Well, that's a complete distortion and really an effort to lay all the blame on a progressive faction that certainly supported all these things, certainly needs to be part of this reckoning, but by no means acted alone.
So there are a few points to make about kind of the debates and recriminations. So one version of this debate has to do with this notion of the groups, which I believe comes out of a podcast discussion on the Ezra Klein show more recently. I think this may be the place where this most recent debate started, but I believe it was Compact contributor Michael Lind who made some references to this notion of the groups as this dominant force in democratic politics, which would essentially be these various kind of NGO entities, doing advocacy for particular kind of constituent groups, as well as for various kinds of agendas. And but I think part of what Lind was pointing out was just that as you brought up the Rio Grande Valley, that these groups, whether they're sort of Latino groups or immigration rights or immigrant rights groups, turned out to be sort of out of that they were treated as proxies for these demographics. And one of the main things we've had reinforced in recent years is that they're quite bad proxies for those demographics. In fact, they've tended to be quite at odds with the demographics they tend to represent. And perhaps the Rio Grande Valley, once a Democratic stronghold flipping red is the most dramatic in response to the Democrats' border policies is maybe the most dramatic example of this. So there's kind of this debate. Okay, like, is it the groups that do we need to just do the Democrats just need to rein in the influence of the groups? I mean, part of what I would say there, which I think gets into your point, is that first of all, there's kind of more of a symbiosis between, I suppose, the sort of sensible centrists of the Democratic coalition and the so-called groups, which are seen as more, representing more fringe positions than this analysis would acknowledge. That these things aren't the idea that you can sort of separate these things out or see them as complete as sort of having opposed interests, I think is not correct. In fact, I would say the Democratic Party as it exists today, its apparatus sort of is that symbiosis, like that they're not this isn't just a fringe element. And I mean, there are various ways we could understand this. One is just that when you have a shift towards this kind of the sort of Clintonian third way centrism, which is in many ways aligned with the Wall Street Journal editorial page on there shall be open borders, as you pointed out, rather than with the old labor movement, which was consistently hostile to high levels of immigration. When you have that alignment, that ideological alignment, there's something missing there, which is, that it risks defaulting to a kind of purely technocratic, um, uh, sort of adjustment of inputs and outputs. And so, what remains part of it and what makes the Democratic Party distinctive is the kind of moral force and impetus and vision that comes from its alignment with these groups that see themselves as successors of the civil rights movement in various ways, right? And I think both of the examples you brought up are important here, because both of them can present themselves as a new frontier in civil rights, and in fact did and have explicitly presented themselves that way, right? As and so, the Democratic Party that sort of sees its roots, the roots of its current coalition in its enactment of the civil rights agenda in the 1960s. It needed to combine that sort of, more technocratic, economistic approach, of sort of rule by experts by the Goldman, the best and the brightest of Goldman Sachs, the sort of Robert Rubin types of the Clinton administration, that needed to be welded to some sort of moral vision, right? That would give it some sense of moral legitimacy as a transformative political force. And so, that's why I think you can't understand these two things as separate. Like they come into place together and essentially make up the party as it currently exists. And I don't think that there's that there's some easy or simple way to kind of disentangle them. And so I think, one version of this debate you've seen is just, oh, there needs to be a lessening of the influence of the groups. Well, the groups are not just some extraneous thing. They're, deeply integrated into the vision of politics that comes out of the sort of 1990s, Clintonian reform of the Democratic Party. And there isn't really any, that short of a much more radical and fundamental, sort of creative destruction of the party, which, as we're seeing on the other side, is a very complicated and uneven process. Trump did appear as a force of that sort of creative destruction and has clearly shaken up the pre-existing coalition in quite a radical way. Nonetheless, there's still quite a bit of the old party that remains. And so, short of something like that, some kind of wrecking ball hitting it and forcing a really massive reconfiguration, I don't think there's sort of a simple resolution of this problem that is being discussed as the groups, because the groups are the party. They're one of the and they are not extraneous to. And you brought up Ezra Klein. I mean, his fellow sort of centrist wonk, Matt Iglesias. His book 1 Billion Americans, which I always think of as in the Dr. Evil voice from Austin Powers, but 1 billion Americans, it's an example of how, okay, yeah, you have a sort of wonkish technocratic figure, who is often seen as at odds with sort of activism, and yet, the agenda that he's laying out there is easily brought into a kind of symbiotic relationship with these, with these kind of more kind of moral and civil rights driven modes of politics. And it's not that those are the same thing. It's just that, that this is the symbiosis that exists, and the two, it kind of each, I would say, needs the other in some profound sense.
With that, thanks, Geoff. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. And for more, obviously, compactmag.com, but also our Substack. Just search for Compact Substack. There you can get Geoff every Friday, as I said, and Sarab, middle of the week.